Okay, so here in part 2 of chapter 13 on fiscal policy, we're actually going to define what fiscal policy is and draw a distinction between discretionary fiscal policy and non-discretionary fiscal policy and how it impacts aggregate demand, which, by the way, we already were talking about in chapter 12 when we were talking about aggregate supply and demand. Okay. So, remembering back to what we're representing as the economy, what we're representing as aggregate demand, right? Real GDP, right? Should probably be a real there, right? Real GDP, so adjusted for inflation. Consumption of individuals. So who's buying the stuff, right? Same, all the stuff we talked about in the aggregate supply demand chapter. So aggregate demand, who's buying the stuff? Consumers, businesses, people buying new homes, government, buying goods and services, net exports, exports minus imports. Right? We're really going to talk very little in this chapter about the net exports piece and focus on these other three. First, most directly, the government impacts government spending, right? So the government decides, right, makes the decisions on how much to spend and modifies those decisions based on a number of factors, including, for fiscal policy, as we'll talk about, trying to influence the economy, especially when things aren't going so well. Now, so the government directly impacts G, right? Because they basically decide on that category, how much the government's spending. The government indirectly, in fact, impacts consumption and investment behavior. Right? So how do they do that? Well, taxes and changes in taxing of individuals and businesses impact consumption and investment. Changes and transfers, right? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid impacts consumption as well. So when the government changes how much they spend directly or how they tax people, how much transfers, which also includes things like unemployment benefits, the government can change aggregate demand, shifting it either left, decreasing, or most importantly, in terms of most fiscal policy actions, try to shift it to the right, increasing aggregate demand. So fiscal policy is changing these things to try to influence aggregate demand. So government modifications in spending and taxing in ways that try to impact real GDP, which again we defined as this, which is again aggregate demand. Now, please be clear, this has nothing to do with the actions of the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, right? That we'll talk about in chapters 14 and 15. This is all about the government spending and taxing decisions and changes of what they're doing. So, mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, we're going to distinguish between discretionary and non-discretionary fiscal policy, starting with discretionary, which is the most often talked about and the most often, reported on when it's occurring in the news, especially including right now with the responses to the coronavirus pandemic and how that's impacting the economy, and how the government's trying to mitigate some of that through historically large discretionary fiscal policy. All right, so government spending and tax changes enacted at the time when there's a problem. So discretionary, right, at their discretion. They're doing it because they see there's an issue, right? So as the previous slide mentioned, directly impacting government spending, right? Spending on goods and services for stuff. So not too much quickly happening on that in the current coronavirus fiscal policy responses that are happening as I record this. But a significant amount of that did happen in the Great Recession, right back in 2009, where in addition to providing people with money and tax relief, etc., more money was spent on education, more money was spent on infrastructure projects, right, building, fixing roads and bridges and doing other type of building, and renewable energy projects, trying to move towards more of a quote-unquote green economy. So that's again directly impacting aggregate demand by increasing consumption of goods and services. Right? The government also indirectly impacts aggregate demand by allowing others to have more resources with which to buy stuff. Right? So decreasing taxes, providing consumers with tax payments, which is typically effectively tax rebates or loans to individuals or loans to businesses. All kinds of things are happening in the CARES Act, right? The Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, enacted March 2020, including, right, most famously publicized, right, direct payments, sometimes called tax rebates, right, but effectively direct payments to families, well, individuals, I should say, $1,200 per adult, $500 per child, right, for those making under 75,000, and decreasing in amount if you make more than that, and then going to zero above some threshold, I believe, about 100,000. That act also includes, right, $367,000 of business loans and grant programs for small businesses, money for hospitals, all kinds of other stuff, right, where money is being given to others that they can then choose what to do with. And we'll talk about the different impacts of direct government spending versus taxes and some of the pros and cons of each as far as trying to help what these are, or both of these, both in the Great Recession and also for this CARES Act, trying to help get out of an economic downturn. Okay. So happening at the time of the crisis. So these types of things, right, almost all of the things that are in the sometimes see reported as $2 or $2.3 trillion historically large fiscal policy stimulus that was just passed last month, impacting consumption, impacting investment. Right? So that was discretionary. So things that are actually proactively changed to try to address an economic downturn. There's also different things that happen that change the amount of government spending and taxing. That happens automatically without the government having to make a decision to do so at all. So these are often called discretionary fiscal policy changes, often also called automatic stabilizers, okay, because they effectively help out in a recession by increasing government spending and reducing taxes, and slow things down in an expansion, right? By decreasing government spending and effectively raising taxes. So these are non-discretionary. Again, they're already built into the system that stabilizes the economy without the government making a proactive decision to do so. It's already in the system. Well, what kind of things are that? Well, what kinds of things does the government spend more money on or provide people with more money when the economy is bad? Unemployment insurance, right? So as I'm recording this, over the last 3 weeks, a historic number of people have filed for unemployment benefits. Over 16 million people, right? In a 3-week period. There had never been more than 600,000 in a 1-week period. We've had 16 million, many times that each of the last 3 weeks. So those people are going to be given money, presumably where they will spend much of it. Other low-income welfare programs, right? Less taxes. So those are some of the things that increase aggregate demand, either directly with more government spending or by increasing the ability of people to buy things, right? Increasing potential consumption from unemployment insurance. When the economy is doing poorly, right? Less taxes are paid. We have a progressive tax system, right? So those people who have lost their job and are collecting unemployment insurance, many of which are going to get less money right, than they had before, or they were getting before. So they'll be in a lower tax bracket, so less taxes will be collected on them, and a smaller percentage, right, because they'll be in a lower tax bracket, will be collected, right? So these are things that increase how much the government's spending when the economy is bad, decrease how much taxes they're collecting when the economy is bad. Okay. And then the opposite happens, right, when the economy is good, right? Unemployment payments, insurance payments go down. People start making more money, so government collects more money, progressive tax system, more people go into higher tax brackets, where these automatic stabilizers, again, they're automatic because nothing proactive has to happen. They're already built into the laws and of the system, which the result is effectively to decrease the extremes of the business cycle. Okay, so whether it's discretionary or non-discretionary, most of the time we're going to focus on the discretionary piece. So fiscal policy can kind of go in two directions, right? Expansionary versus contractionary, right? And expansionary is clearly what's happening now in the coronavirus, right? And the goal, right, is to get rid of a recessionary gap, right, which we discussed and defined in chapter 12, right, when the economy is producing less than it potentially could. We clearly have a recessionary gap with 16 more million people as I make this recording early in 2020. Recessionary gap with 16 more million people unemployed now than there were 3 weeks ago. Right? So a lot of the stimulus is trying to offset some of that decrease in aggregate demand, right? The shift from aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 1 that is happening as I speak, as I make these slides. Trying to shift, at least to some degree, it back. Right? So again, this usually happens when, I need to highlight, usually expansionary fiscal policy happens when we have a recessionary gap, when we're below potential GDP, to try to move us back more quickly towards long-run equilibrium, right? Where we're producing, the economy is producing as much as it can, right? Potential GDP. Now, sometimes we have contractionary fiscal policy, right? Far less often, frankly, as far as the fiscal policy goes. But if we are above potential GDP, right, the government could say, all right, well, let's tax some more. Right? And the book describes how in 1968 that was done temporarily, where taxes were increased temporarily because it was deemed we were in this situation where the economy was had an inflationary gap to try to fight off that inflation. Quite frankly, in pretty much every situation like this since then, any kind of fighting an inflationary gap has the government's pretty much left that to monetary policy and the Federal Reserve. Right? But theoretically, this is something that can happen. As the government collects more money in taxes, tries to reduce aggregate demand to reduce the inflationary gap. And as I say that, right, this is virtually opposite the thing that was happening up, in 2018 and 19. Okay, and let's describe that again. This is all pre-coronavirus discussion right now. So, as we've talked about in prior chapters, right, in 2000, let me just put it all up there on the slide. So in 2017, we had tax cuts that helped lower taxes predominantly, right, for businesses, but also to some degree for individuals. Budget stimulus, there was basically also more spending agreed to at the time in 2018, right, for both discretionary and non-discretionary spending for defense and non-defense, I guess I should more highlight, which had the effect of increasing aggregate demand, so expansionary fiscal policy. The problem that most economists saw in this, right, including many at the Federal Reserve, is that we were at very minimum at this long-run equilibrium back in 2018 and definitely 19, historically low unemployment rates. If any, we were likely already, right, had an inflationary gap, right? So when further stimulus was done, many feared that there would be inflationary pressure, and creating more debt, right, than we could afford. But I'll talk more about that idea later. But anyway, expansionary fiscal policy, most economists agree that makes sense when you got this situation, but not when you are at or above potential GDP. Okay. Although the Krugman textbook, I don't believe mentions this at all. Some of the reason, or especially with the tax cuts, that those argue for them, even when the economy was doing well, is that theoretically they weren't focused on kind of short-term increases in aggregate demand. They were focused more on increasing aggregate supply, right? Often characterized and described back in the days of Reagan, supply side economics, right? Increasing the incentive to produce, right? Focused on tax changes to lower tax rates. So with the theory that, for example, if corporate income tax rates went down, businesses would have more incentive to invest. That businesses, again, would have more incentive to invest, and that paradoxically, by lowering income taxes, the economy would grow so fast that more tax collections would actually occur. That's the theory. One of the problem that most economists see with that theory is that virtually every study of efforts to do such supply side interventions into the economy have never been found pretty much to have that result, right? Where lowering taxes, that the growth in the economy actually paid for the tax cuts through expansion of economic activity. And that is this part 2. Part 3, we will analyze, so when the government does some amount of government spending or reduces some amount of taxes, what's the theory say about how much aggregate demand actually grows? We'll talk about multiplier effects.